The fifth topic is quality control for people. Okay, so we've talked about quality control from the aspect or the perspective of the stuff we make, the stuff we do. And stuff is wonderful and stuff is important for safety. You know, if you weld something and you weld a ladder to a pole, you don't want that ladder to fall off and have someone be hurt. So what we're focused on now is quality from a human point of view, okay? How can we ensure, effectively what we're talking about here, when you go into work, you go home in the evening safe, okay? One of the mantras of Newfoundland Power, for example, a company like Newfoundland Power, is everybody goes home at night, okay? That summarizes their safety ethos, meaning that their goal is for people to come into work, be safe at work, and go home safely in the evening to their families. And that's basically what occupational health and safety is all about. That's the major core thrust of anything we do with regards to occupational health and safety. So that when you finish your work, you can go home to your family. Government has really been the driver for occupational health and safety standards, okay? Industry industry lives with the standards, and unions have been useful with regards to pushing the standards, but ultimately government has set standards for industry to ensure that people can go home at night. Some organizations take quality with regards to their staff and their people much more seriously than others. What government tries to do is to level the playing field, that make sure everyone is covered and everybody is safe at work. In government, what each province, because Canada is kind of weird in the way our constitution's set up, labor or industry or workers and the legislation regarding workers is considered or deemed to be a provincial responsibility, meaning the provincial government, the provinces, are responsible for worker safety. So about 95% of the workers in Canada are covered under provincial legislation. Federal workers, people who work for Canada Post, the CBC, or any of these entities that would be considered as federal, banks would be federal, they're covered under occupational health and safety legislation by the federal government. So Canada has a kind of a patchwork of OHS standards. Every province has theirs, the federal government has its, and the territories have theirs. So depending on where you work and who you work for, the standard that you have that manages you, or the standard that covers you, could be different. Now, effectively, all of the standards are basically the same. Some finer points are different from one jurisdiction to another, and this is, something that most governments have tried to iron out. So, but it's not a perfect match between one province and another province, or the provinces and the federal. But the basic goal of every Occupational Health and Safety Act is the same: to prevent accidents and injury to health arising out of or linked with or occurring in the course of employment. That's the basic definition of occupational health and safety in terms of the legislation. The mechanism, or the thing that makes occupational health and safety real, is the legislation that every province put into place. Now, in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have the Newfoundland and Labrador Occupational Health and Safety Act, and this is the Department of Digital Government Services. There are links to all of the legislation and all of the laws that deal with everything from alerts, harassment and violence, safety guidelines, various information bulletins, guides, these sorts of things. This is what we call the legislation, or the act. In all government, be it provincial, federal, you will have things called acts, and acts are pieces of legislation that the legislature, respective legislature, has put in place. And that legislation outlines several things. So, for example, employers general, in the case of Occupational Health and Safety Act, for example, the definitions, the employer's general duty, the employee's duty, supervisor's duty, workers' general duty, specific duties of workers, imminent danger, this issue, we'll talk about that in a second, duty for self-employed people, duties of suppliers, duties of contractors, advisory councils, liabilities, investigation powers, remedies, the board that investigates occupational health safety, the appeal processes, various committees in the workplace, how they're set up, the duties of the representative on the committees, supervisor duties, how accidents are reported, how medical reports are put in place, and so on. So they're very detailed in what happens. So, and again, it's written, I'm going to call it in a legal ease, okay? These legislations, for example, without limiting the generality of Section 4, an employer shall, these are the things the employer has to do. So they're written, as I say, very much in a legal terminology. So the act that you are seeing here is interpreted through, let me just go back from here now, a more specific piece of legislation called regulations. So the act is a general, this is what we want to do. The regulations are a companion document or a companion piece of legislation that says this is how we're going to do it. Okay, so the regulations lay out the processes and procedures of how the act will be put in place, how they interpret it, how the responsibilities are laid out. What is the definition of a safe working load of equipment? What is the definition of working alone? These sorts of things, violence prevention, personal conduct, barriers, illumination. So it's much more fine detailed, okay? So normally there are acts and regulations. So the act is a broad piece of legislation. The regulations deal with the specific elements of it and how things are laid out. You think of things like thermal environment, how hot or how cold. So very, 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 very specific, okay? But both of those together work to ensure workers' safety. In broad terms, when we think about the Occupational Health and Safety Act, it looks at the employer's duty, what the employers are responsible for doing, and they require the employer to ensure the health, safety, and welfare of his or her workers. It also outlines workers' duties. So if you are a worker, you are an employee, you have duties too. What are they? And generally, they are the worker has to take reasonable care to protect his or her own health and that of workers and other persons at or near the workplace. So if you're a welder, for example, you have to, as a welder, you have to put on your mask in and of itself, but you also have to ensure that there's not 6 people behind you without masks watching you. So again, the worker is responsible for him or herself, but also the environment that they work in. So there is a responsibility of workers as well. It also outlines contractor duties. And, if someone comes in as a private contractor or a subcontractor, they have duties for occupational health and safety too. And it requires that the principal contractor ensure that their employees, workers, and self-employed persons comply with the legislation. Suppliers, people who supply stuff to the workplace, they're required to make sure that the tools, appliances, equipment supplied comply with the OHS legislation. So these responsibilities on employer, workers, contractors, suppliers are basically what the OHS legislation is all about. And the legislation empowers the workers, the board, basically the organization that handles occupational health and safety, it empowers them to shut down a workplace if those conditions are not met. So if someone goes in or someone reports and says, these things are not being complied with, the legislation allows for that place to be shut down. And obviously, nobody wants that to happen because that costs lots of money. So the following areas are really addressed in the Act. Appeals, how, for example, if the employer feels they're hard done by, if the employee feels they're hard done by, how can they appeal it? This is a key one. I can't overstress. If you're a younger worker, for example, that I know you guys are, if you're, what is it that the legislation does in order to back you up? The key thing that the legislation does to back you up is it gives you the right to refuse unsafe work. Okay? So if your employer comes to you and say, I want you to do something, generally, as an employee, you're obliged to do it. That's part of the employment contract. You work for them. They ask you to do things. You do things. They pay you in return. Okay? But let's assume that they're asking you to do this and you consider it to be unsafe to your health or someone else's health in one way or another. The legislation gives you the right to refuse, and it provides the worker with the right to refuse to do work which he or she has grounds to believe is dangerous to his or her health and safety or that of another person. And it will guarantee that you will not get barred. Negative consequences will not come to you because of that. So workers can't discriminate against you because you complain. Accident reporting establishes procedures for how accidents are reported. Obviously, the goal of the legislation is to prevent accidents, but if we assume accidents will happen, there is a process for how those accidents need to be reported. It also says that as your employer grows, so if you're looking at IOC or even Harrison where you work, if you're over a certain number of employees, I think it's 10, you need to have an occupational health and safety committee. So that legislation says that the employer must have it is not would like to, they must. So I would assume that in all your workplaces you have such a committee, and the committee is mandated to meet a certain number of times a year. Workers covered by the Newfoundland and Labrador Occupational Health and Safety Act have the right to refuse unsafe work. That can't be overstressed. Another principal right for workers is the right to participate in identifying and correcting workplace safety issues. So it's your job as much as the employer's to find the problems and report them. So to ensure workers have the right, the Occupational Health and Safety Act in Newfoundland and Labrador requires joint health and safety committees, as I just mentioned. So the regulations that we saw, which were the more specific document, explain how the act is to be applied in specific circumstances. So you go to the regulations and it will probably outline every potential or most potential situations that would occur in the workplace. So for example, following regulation with respect to illumination is found in Section 12 of the Occupational Health and Safety Regulations under Newfoundland Occupational Health and Safety Act. And it says that the employer shall provide a suitable lighting, whether natural or artificial, in every part of the workplace while the workers are present. But the illumination standards shall not be less than the standards set by the American National Standards Institute Illuminating Engineering Society. There's the number. And so, how bright do the lights need to be? That sort of thing. So an employer shall ensure that all glazed windows and skylights used in the lighting of the workplace shall be kept clean. The artificial light source or reflective surface shall be positioned, screened, or provided with shade to prevent glare. And when the visibility within the work area is restricted due to the presence of smoke, steam, or other substances in the atmosphere, and where the condition might result in a worker being injured, suitable means shall be adopted to correct the hazard, a fan, for example, or these sorts of things. So these lay out specific standards that need to be in place in order to enforce the act. Specifically too, and again, you've all done this at some point in time, and this is a workplace hazardous material information system. Part of OHS, one of the things that are so important is we all work in workplaces that have hazardous materials. So for example, my thing of Lysol wipes here could be an example of hazardous material. But normally what it covers is workplace stuff. So if it's a workplace type item, so if I assume this product is available in a workplace style, that will be covered under what we call WHMIS. And what WHMIS does is it backs up, reflects the major themes that we saw in the Occupational Health and Safety Act by ensuring that you, as a worker, know the potential dangers of what you're working with. So the right to know issue is front and center in WHMIS. And effectively, it is an education tool that helps you know what things could potentially harm you at work in terms of the substances that are brought into the work. So it's a comprehensive plan providing information on the safe use of hazardous materials in Canadian workplaces and support workers' right to know. Laws across Canada require chemical suppliers and supply employers with information about hazardous products for their workers. So WHMIS applies to products specifically for use in workplaces. So this is not specifically for use in workplace, so it's not covered in WHMIS. However, other products, and I don't have one here ready, but other products that if you look at when you go into your workplace as cleaners or whatever, normally they would have a WHMIS label on them. And the WHMIS label is that dashed line around the product. So they're specifically designed for the workplace. And in order for those to be brought into the workplace, there has to be some things with them. They need to come with a label on the product that says it has something in it that's dangerous, in other words, a WHMIS label. And it also has to come with something called a material safety data sheet, an MSDS, which is basically it's a sheet of paper that's put in a room somewhere in your place of work that you can look at, and you have access to, that tells you what are the specific issues of that particular product. So for example, if it's a form of Lysol cleaner that's geared for the work environment, it would say what type of products, what type of chemicals are in that Lysol, and what are some of the issues you need. Don't breathe it in, wear a mask, or wear eye protection, don't use it in an enclosed space. These sorts of things are covered off in the material safety data sheet, but also that would include not only what's in the product, but what to do if someone swallows it, if someone eats it, if someone breathes it in. What are the emergency procedures that you need to put in place? So effectively, the WHMIS covers a lot of things, and we could summarize those three things by saying, okay, look, it's all about giving people the right to know, that education element, the safety data sheets that I just talked about, and the label that is on the product itself. And that will help you do a better job at identifying what potential dangers there are in the workplace for you from that. When a supplier sends that to the workplace, their job is to make sure that it comes with that label, MSDS, and the information can get to you through them. The employer, once it's accepted in the workplace, the employer's responsibility is to ensure that you are fully aware of those products. In other words, they need to educate and train workers on those products, the health and safety aspects of them, ensure the products are labeled, ensure that the product is safely stored, and that the safety data sheet is available to you to read. And it also says, the legislation says that you have to do this WHMIS course. Now, I know you guys have done it. I don't know if you've done it in school or you do it at work, but you have to do it every so often. I think it's every 3 years, if I'm not mistaken. And WHMIS is actually being replaced with another system now. It does exactly the same thing, but it's going to be standardized across North America as opposed to just Canada. And if you look at any of those WHMISs, you will see that there are various labels on them, things like, explosion, or it's compressed, or that it's poisonous, or that it's oxidized, or these sorts of things.